and I will be doing this throughout the presentation, not a lot, but I'll have a number of questions just to kind of keep you a little bit more engaged and kind of give me an understanding of where you're coming from also on your desires when it comes to houseplants. So it looks like, yeah, mostly for most people, I don't care. I just like houseplants kind of a thing, and that's great. I'm kind of that way too. I have plants that, I don't know if you can, I don't know if you see this right here. That's about the last blossom of my Christmas cactus. There's one more bud. So I've got another week or so of Christmas cactus blossoms. And so, you know, there are things we can do to make those, extend that blooming season out. It's always fun to see them when they're in full bloom, but also I like to have plants. All right, we'll go ahead and end this poll. So basically, you know, just submit the poll and this is, I'll share this with you once in a while, but pretty much, you know, people like to have either flowering or green plants. It doesn't really matter. So, all right, we'll move that out of the way. Now, I'm Ron Patterson, University of Idaho Extension horticulture educator in Bonneville County. I've been in Extension since 2005, but only in Idaho since a year ago last November. So November of 2018 is when I moved back to Idaho. I grew up in Rexburg, and so I'm pretty much an Idaho boy, and it really hurt to live in Utah for 15 years, but it was okay. I mean, I got some good experiences while I was down there. I'm glad to be back. So anyway, we have our presentation today is on houseplants, and it's not, you know, we do a lot of master gardener training, and there's a chapter in our book on houseplants, but it's not really one of those classes we teach to the master gardener program. And so I thought, well, let's just throw this out for just generally anybody. Master gardeners can join if they want to, but anybody anywhere in the world, I guess, could join us if they want to as well. So that's what we're talking about, houseplants today. Plants is what it's kind of, I like to think of it as a gardener's winter fix. You know, you can't grow a whole lot. I love to garden. I've been gardening my whole life. Matter of fact, some of my earliest memories are from gardening. And so this is something that I just enjoy doing, working with plants. The big question is, you know, do plants really belong in houses? And of course, if you're here at this presentation, my guess is you'll say yes, just like I would say yes. But why do we do that? Why do we grow plants indoors? There's beautification is an option. You know, one of the things that we like to see the flowers and things like that, the green plants and growing. Better air. Now, some people will say, yeah, plants don't really clean the air of the volatile compounds that are in the air. And that's true. They don't do a whole lot, a little bit, but they do help to convert the carbon dioxide that we breathe out into oxygen so that we can breathe that back in. And so that's a method of cleaning the air as well, in my opinion, because carbon dioxide is toxic to people. So better air and ambience. I think the ambience is probably really the biggest factor for a lot of people. And matter of fact, if you go to shopping malls, they have big planters and islands down the shopping mall walkway that have plants in them. They have skylights designed so that those plants can grow and thrive in big office buildings that they design nowadays. Instead of having the old hospital-style buildings, they open those up and they provide light and so that they grow plants and provide that ambience there in the environment around us. So that's a big thing there too. And I like it partly for photographic opportunities. I like to take pictures, and that gives me something that I can take pictures of during the winter, besides other things you photograph. So, and it is, the thing about it is just really, it's really therapeutic to take care of the plants and to kind of keep those growing and thriving. And you hear a lot of times, you know, some of these plants that I'll show you tonight are plants that my wife's grandparents had, and we've taken starts off from those and kept them going for, you know, the 38 years that we've been married, plus, you know, however long they had them previous to that. So the question then, of course, is, will all plants do well indoors? And the answer to that is they can if you provide the right environment. So we need to consider these environmental factors in order for our plants to thrive indoors. Now, certain plants are going to need a lot of light. Some plants don't want very much light. I mean, a lot less light. Some plants like it dry, some plants like it wet. And so understanding those requirements is what we really need to do to get these plants to thrive. So we look at the light. Of course, you've got to have the carbon dioxide. And then we've got to think about the quality of light and the length of the light, and then the nutrients in the soil. And oh, did I say light? So light is really one of those big considerations. Moisture and humidity is also another thing that you want to think about as you try to get your plants to thrive and do well in the environment that we have here. So let's talk about light, since that seems to kind of pop up a lot on my list there. When we talk about light, we talk about two different things. We talk about quantity and quality. So let's look at the quantity part of the light. It's the intensity of the light, as opposed to, you're in a shady situation or you're in direct sun kind of a thing. So the intensity can be affected by the size of the window. I've got a basement, some rooms in my basement, they've got those little tiny, you can't crawl out them, sneak out of the house size windows crawling out of the basement. Well, I can't anyway now. So anyway, they don't let a lot of light in. And so one of the things I've done with my basement is I've put in I need some egress windows anyway. And so I've put in some bigger windows that you can actually let a lot more light in. It makes a big difference just in the light itself. The direction that the window faces, if it's facing north versus south, especially in the wintertime, makes a big difference. And then the season, and then the day length, how long is the day? In the wintertime here, it's kind of short. You get up towards Alaska and it's a lot shorter than by the same token in the summertime, they've got really, really long days up there. So day length also, these are things that affect light quantity. Now let's talk a little bit about quality of light. Now we have our natural light, the sunlight that we have is what we'd call probably the best quality of light that we could supply for the plants. And then we have to supplemental type light. So when I start my vegetable garden plants indoors, I supply them with a supplemental light so that they can do well, because there's not quite enough light inside the house to get them growing and doing well as they would like. They need more, not just more light, but better quality light as well. What determines light quality? Is it the spectrum available to plants, or is it intensity or brightness of the light? Kind of split half and half, looks like. The spectrum is not quality, okay, the spectrum is quality. The intensity or bright, you can have a very bright light that has the wrong spectrum in it, and you don't get as good a quality, you don't get as good a growth from the plants. And so the brightness or intensity of the light itself is not the quality, it's that spectrum. And a full spectrum is best, but they've found, a little bit more blue has one effect on it, a little bit more red has one effect on it, and things like that. So when we talk about light quality, we're talking about the spectrum of the light, not necessarily the intensity of the light. All right, so light quality then, natural versus supplemental. We talked a little bit about that one. So now I've got another quick poll. All right, which of the following symptoms would indicate a plant is getting enough light? So as we look at this, the pale green, enough light, you're going to typically have a darker green plant leaf as opposed to the pale green. The etiolated stems, that's the term for when stems kind of get leggy and stretchy, a little bit longer and between the nodes and normal. And so that's what's etiolation is stretching of the stem like that. And so that's an indication that you're not getting enough light. So that one wouldn't work. Vigorous, yes. If it's a good vigorous, then you're probably getting enough light. Healthy leaves, yes, that's definitely. Smaller leaves, typically, no. Your leaves are going to be, it's kind of strange. Anyway, the larger than normal leaves is also kind of a shady kind of a thing, as opposed to the smaller leaves. You need to kind of know the normal size of leaf to judge that. And the dropping leaves, then that's usually an indication. A lot of times people call and say, oh, my tree is dropping leaves. I said, well, it is the old leaves inside the canopy, or is it the new leaves out on the outside? So, well, it's the older leaves on the inside of the canopy. And so that's fine. The tree is shedding those because it's not getting any food from those leaves. And so it's just getting rid of that extra weight onto it. They don't need those leaves on the inside. So that dropping of leaves is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means you're not getting enough light to a specific leaves, but it could be also an indication of not enough light. Compact, sturdy stems, yes, and vibrant blossoms, yes. Those would also be indications that you're getting enough light. Okay, so adequate light. Now we'll look at this again. Vigorous. It's got healthy leaves, it's compact, sturdy stems, and vibrant blossoms. Those are the things we're looking for when we look at our houseplants. If they're getting kind of stretchy or they're leaning toward the window or things like that, then that's a pretty good indicator that we need to look at maybe the placement of the plant. I mean, they'll lean towards the window, so you rotate those around. That's a different issue, but if they get a little bit stretchy. So now, too little light, the things that you'll see from those, you get either large or smaller than normal leaves, one way or the other, which seems kind of weird, but it's kind of like drought and too much water cause the same symptoms in plants, and too little light can do that same thing. Pale color, those leggy stems and the leaves drop off, or even if it dies, could be a pretty good indicator. Okay, so the solution then, if we see these indicators that our plant is not getting enough light, what are the solutions? Move it closer to the window, or put it by a larger window, or put it by a window with a different orientation to the south or west rather than the north. Okay, you can dust or clean your plants, provide some supplemental light. I grew a banana tree here in Idaho. I got it when I was going to school up at BYU, Idaho. Of course, it wasn't BYU, Idaho at the time, but there was a banana tree in one of the greenhouses. So I took one of the starts from it and got it started in a pot. And I grew this banana tree. Well, my house, little trailer house that I was living in, wasn't big enough for a banana tree. So I gave it to my brother-in-law, who had a little bit bigger house, and he put it in his house. But he didn't have enough light. There wasn't enough window there. And so he had to add some supplemental light. He had to put some lights around it. So he got that, finished that growing out, and actually produced bananas off of it here in Idaho. So there you go. There is also that possibility, and we're talking about too little light, we could also get too much light. And so what are some of the symptoms then that we would see with too much light? This bleaching of the leaves, this necrosis of the tissue, this death of the leaf tissue here, where it's getting that bright, direct sunlight. This plant does not like that, and so you get that. It kills those tissues right there. So that bleaching of the leaves can cause a problem. Now you get down, okay, that's back to that pale plant kind of a thing. Yeah, I was mostly talking about pale green as opposed to actual necrosis of the tissue there. So these scorched sunspots, that's the most typical thing you'll see when you get too much light. And so some plants do not like a lot of light. Some of our houseplants. The houseplants that we have, the ones that do best in the house, are generally understory type plants, or under a forest or jungle type situation, and not the kind that are out in the open meadows, kind of an environment that they like. They like to grow, and that's the plants that we've selected, that we've developed to do to survive in our environment in the home. So solution then, if we've got a house or plant that's getting that sun scorch or bleaching of the leaves, well, get them out of that direct light. And usually that's just enough. Just get them out, move them to the side of the window so that they're out of that direct light. It may be that depending on how the sun's moving in your around your house, that you really don't have a lot of choices in that particular window. So you may need to just move it to a different window. North windows work quite well for plants that require very little, if any, direct sunlight. Now, when we talk about supplementing light, the quality that is actually quite important. Fluorescent lights, tubes, they're more of a blue typically, but they can put some full spectrum type tubes in your fixtures, but they tend to be a little bit more blue. Now these compact fluorescent light bulbs, they kind of are a little bit more of an orangey color, and so they're not as much blue typically as we see with the tubes. They can be more efficient, definitely more efficient than incandescent light bulbs. They don't produce as much heat. They'll produce some heat, but not nearly as much. And so they do have that full spectrum available. You can place these, because they don't produce a lot of heat, you can place them fairly close to your plants. So, for example, when I'm starting my vegetables indoors again, you want those fluorescent tubes to be within about 4 to 6 inches of the plants themselves. You don't want them to be far away, because you're going to lose a lot of that light. You want the lights to be closer in and allow those plants to absorb more daylight. So if you're going to supplement with light, you want to supply the light up fairly close to the plant. But if it's an incandescent bulb, you got too much heat there. So those you have to back away. But the fluorescent tubes you can put in. Okay, incandescent, they're more red. They're encouraging flowering more rather than the foliage. So the reds and the blues have a little bit different effect on the plant growth. They're hotter and they're less efficient, so you lose a lot of money just to the heat itself. And then there's the newer LED lights. The plant doesn't care where the light comes from. All it cares about is the quantity and quality of light. So if you can get a lot of quantity and quality, the spectrum of the light from these LED bulbs, they work really quite nicely. They'll work just as well as anything else that we supply them with. You know, I'm remodeling my basement, and so I'm putting in some of these LED lights, and you can actually change the spectrum on those lights to be a cooler blue color or a warmer orange color or somewhere in between those two. You can flip a switch and it'll change that actual spectrum. It's just kind of cool, actually. So the LED provides us a little bit more versatility, and they're a lot cooler than the fluorescent even. A lot more efficient. Okay, so now light quality. We're still talking about light. Remember, this very important part. So when we talk about the quality of light, we're talking about the light spectrum. And this is what we're looking at. These are the visible light section in here, and it's actually the lights, the spectrum that we can't see. There's a lot of light that we can't see. These X-ray lights, these UV lights, infrared, and the far red. And so we don't really see those, but they're there, and the plant still can get something out of those, or be damaged by some of those, or be affected by some of those other spectrums that we don't even see. And that's where we get into photoperiodism. So we'll pull up another poll. And what the world is photoperiodism? So we'll ask that question. Photoperiodism is factors that allow placing of a photo in a specific historical context, or is it the response of an organism to seasonal changes in day length? Well, it looks like y'all had the same answer. The response to an organism, and I say organism because it's not just plants. Sheep breed in the fall, so they'll have their lambs in the spring, in fall and winter, and then spring and early summer. The same thing with the deer. You know, the breeding season for deer and elk, it's in the fall. They go through that gestation in the wintertime, and they have their babies in the springtime. Well, the reason for that is so that there'll be some grass for the babies to be able to start eating and get weaned off from the mother's milk quicker, and they'll be able to grow. And by the time the warm summer's done, they've got enough size on them and strength that they can survive the winter. Just a evolutionary kind of a thing. And the same thing with plants. Plants are also affected by that. Now, there's two different. Phototropism is the response of a plant to light, or response, of a plant to light. So when you talk about, you can have a positive phototropic response. In other words, the green part of plant grows towards the light, and you see that when a house plant is placed by the window, it grows toward the light. That's that positive phototropism. At the same time, roots have a negative response to that light. So that phototropic response of roots is negative, is moving away from the light. And so that's a lot of times when you're trying to get a cutting to settle in. I guess I can stop sharing that, huh? You try to get a cutting to settle in. It works best if you can block out that light. So we talk about phototropism. It's kind of cool. There are these photoreceptors inside the plant, and they have a response to the light. So we have these phytochromes. The red phytochrome kind of towards the daylight, red light rays in the day. It moves these phytochromes from this active form or towards this active form, PFR, which is a very fast response. The light comes on, and the plant's the phytochrome moves to the PFR stage. At nighttime, it slowly trickles back towards the PR status or stage of that phytochrome. And so the phytochrome is changing depending on the light that it's receiving. And so the light comes on and it moves very fast to the red, to the PFR, and then during the nighttime it kind of trickles back towards the far red. Now, let's see, another photoreceptor is cryptochrome, and this kind of has a little bit effect, kind of training that to the circadian clock, to light and that kind of a thing. And that's more of a blue and UVA spectrum kind of thing. But we're going to talk about this phytochrome mostly here. So back in the 1920s or so, they did some research and they said, okay, certain plants, I mean, they kind of knew this, and chrysanthemums flower in the fall. And so when they did the research on these plants, why are they doing that? Said, well, this is a day length response. More recent research in the 60s and 70s has actually found that it's not a day length response, it's actually a night length response. And so think back to the phytochromes. They're transferring over from the PR to the PFR very fast in the daylight, and then very slowly back over to the PR during the nighttime. And then all of a sudden it's in the middle of the night and you turn on a light on that plant, and all of a sudden very fast it's back here. And so it doesn't get that accumulation of the long night. And so you can stop a plant that needs long days or needs short days, long nights. For example, a Christmas cactus, you can stop that from blooming just by turning a light on it during the middle of the night. It will not bloom. Now, temperature has a little bit of effect with that as well, but what they really want is that they want a short day, but what they really want is a long night. And so don't go up and get your midnight snack in the middle of the night if you got a Christmas cactus in your kitchen, all right? Or to do it without opening the refrigerator so the light doesn't go. It doesn't take a whole lot of light, just a little bit of a direct light onto the plant, and you'll have that effect on the plant. Now, I've had sometimes when I've had light on one side of the plant, and then the window that I've had it in is away from the light, and there's no outside light on the plant. And so the window side will actually start blooming a lot of times before the room side of the house will start blooming, because it's getting that shading. It's not getting that direct light when the lights are turned on. So be aware, the chrysanthemum is one of those that's really affected by that. There's the Christmas cactus and the Thanksgiving cactus and the Easter cactus are all affected by the night length. Okay, the poinsettias that you do, Christmas time, the Utah's day length is just about perfect to get poinsettias to color up. It's not the flower; it's actually the leaves. Get the leaves to color up for Christmas time. Again, that's a photoperiodism response. And so here in Idaho, they've got to have that long night, right? Well, we get the long night a little bit quicker than they do down in Utah. And so our poinsettias will actually start to color up too early, and they're kind of past that really nice peak part when they get to Christmas time. And so in order to do that, then we've got to you need to provide the shade, but you need to keep the nights a little bit shorter until about 6 weeks or so before the time you want to, and then you need to provide light free, a long night for those to color up for the fall. So that's kind of cool about these photoperiodism. So I had people say, well, how come my Christmas cactus isn't blooming? Well, I say, put it in a room where you don't turn on the light in the middle of the night, and it'll start blooming. And they come back to me a few weeks later, by golly, my Christmas cactus is going gangbusters. So it really does work. You want to have an uninterrupted night. So short day is an uninterrupted night. Now, some plants respond to long days. For example, onions, the bulbing of onions is a response to days getting longer. And so if you want to interrupt that, then you're going to have to create a longer night. You don't not create a shorter day. You're going to have to create a longer night in order to have that effect. So you can have a long day. Oh, okay, a long short day. So you're going from a long day to a short day. So that's what the chrysanthemums do. You're going a long day down to a short day, which is actually a short night down to a long night, a long day, and then a short day to a long day, which is a short night to a long night. A long night to a short. Yeah, you get those words all mixed up. Long night is a short day. Long night to a short day to a short night. Long night to a short night. That's your onions. Okay, they bulb as the days get longer, and then you've got the short season onions. You got the intermediate season and the long day onions. Those long day onions don't bloom or bulb up down in the southern part of the United States, and the short day onions, they try to bulb up too soon up here in our area and even farther north. They try to bulb up too soon, and they don't have the leaf structure volume to kind of help those to bulb up very nicely. And so you need to select onions based on your day length season during the summer. And then there are certain plants, a lot of plants that are just day neutral. They don't care that when they get healthy and whatnot, they'll bloom. And so again, a lot of this is the way the plants have developed so that they provide a good continual life for the ability to produce seeds and things like that. So again, chrysanthemums, poinsettias, calendula, Christmas cactus, and onions, these are all affected by night length. Okay, now temperature can have some effect on that. So as we think about temperature, we want to try to mimic the natural environment as much as possible. So for Christmas cactuses, they'll respond better if the temperature's down around 65 degrees as opposed to 75 degrees. And so if you want your Christmas, it'll still bloom even at 75 degrees, but it responds a little bit better at a cooler temperature. So try to mimic that natural environment as much as possible. Well, since most of these plants are woodland type plants, our homes are probably about the right temperature for most of these house plants. And so we don't have to worry about it too much. Now your tropical plants, they probably want it a little bit warmer, but not a whole lot. But then humidity can have a play on that as well. Desert plants like it quite a bit warmer, typically. And of course, they typically like a lot brighter light too. So think about your temperatures then by the window. Are they cooler or are they warmer? And then you want to avoid things like the heat registers, those vents where the air comes out of your forced air system. Avoid fireplaces and avoid televisions. They can all produce extra heat that we don't want to raise the temperature around the plants. And computers can also do that same thing. And so, be aware of that temperature around you have microclimates within your house, just like you do outside in your garden. And so kind of be aware of that. All right, let's do another poll real quick. What is the most common reason for houseplant failure? Is it too little light, improper watering, too much fertilizer, or the owner doesn't have a green thumb? Yes, it is. Improper watering is the most common reason for house plant failure. Too little light can be a problem. I talked a lot about light. Light is very, very, very important in order to have a good, thriving plant. But usually we either forget them and neglect them, or we water them too much. And so So that watering can be a big issue. So that's so the question, the answer to that is the improper watering. All right, moisture. So let's talk about watering. And we talk about moisture. There's a couple things. Ventilation and humidity are very important. So you need to have air movement, and you also need to have a lot of humidity depending on the plants, of course, especially if you're talking tropical plants. So usually ventilation is not a problem because your air is moving through it and around it in the house and things like that. The air is not really stagnant or stale. So that's usually not a big problem. But humidity kind of depends on the plants, what their humidity requirements might be. So things that you can do, if you need to have more humidity, you can mist the plants. You can get a humidifier. You can use a pebble tray. I like to use those relish tops. You get those relish trays from the store, and you got the black top to it. And you just flip that over and put your house plants on that, and you overwater it a little bit and let the water leak out into this relish top, and it basically becomes a pebble tray. And that water, it'll evaporate into the air and raise the humidity around the plants. Or if you're really, especially if you're in a tropical type plant, a terrarium is basically kind of a closed system, and so the humidity will get up there, it'll stabilize, and the plant will. They don't grow very fast because it only produces so much carbon dioxide and only so much oxygen, and so that it's kind of a slow way of controlling growth. Watering then is a thing. Usually we'll either neglect them or we'll love them to death. And so I prefer to use the finger method. In other words, I don't water them on a regular schedule. I go and I'll put my finger in the soil, and if it's still wet, it doesn't need water. If it's kind of still moist, it still doesn't need water. If it's dry down to a half inch or so, depending on the plant, some plants need a little bit more even moisture. But for most plants, a good general rule of thumb, if it's dried down about a half inch or so, then it's about time to water it again. Okay, so it's all right if the top of it's dry, but it doesn't take very long to go from the top dry to quite dry inside here. But so you check it, and as soon as you got that moisture down there, half inch or so, go ahead and water the plant. And that works for almost all plants. There'll be some different things a little bit different. Schedule method doesn't really work. Plants may have, especially wintertime, you don't need to water them nearly as much in the wintertime. Summertime, you got a lot more sunlight, a lot more photosynthesis taking place, and photosynthesis requires water, so you got to have a lot more moisture in the soil to support that photosynthesis. Depending on where you're closer to the window or farther away from the window, summer, winter, those things. Water temperature can have an effect. The temperature of our water around here can be down to 60 degrees, 58 degrees. That's pretty cool. And so it kind of can shock some plants. They generally do okay, but just kind of keep that in mind. If you've got plants that are a little more tropical or desert, you may want to put your water into your water pitcher or whatever and let it sit out for a day or so before you actually do the watering, so that the temperature is up closer to the 70 degrees of our houses. And here's the thing, and I brought this plant here. Hopefully you can see this. Matter of fact, I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can make sure that you can see this plant right here. If you look at these leaves, you see that burning on the leaves here. A couple of months ago, my wife rescued this plant from a beloved relative who got soft water in her house, and everything in the house has now got soft water, and so she watered her plants with soft water, and now she's starting to complain. I told her at the time, I said, "Well, you don't want to use that water for your plants." She said, "Well, I'm not going to go outside to get the water." So all of her plants are starting to show this dead on the tips here. So we rescued this a couple months ago, and you notice that these newer leaves, they don't have that necrosis of those tips. They're doing a much better job, and they're not showing that damage. So do not use soft water. So when I haven't got a water softener in my house yet, but I'm going to eventually get a water softener in my house. My wife would like to have the clothes washer and the shower and all that be soft water. Well, I am going to have one line, well, actually two lines. The cold water to the kitchen sink will be hard, so that I've got something. The hot water will be soft, the cold water will be hard. So I'll have some hard water there, and also the water to my refrigerator that I drink. that's not going to be soft water. That's going to be hard water too. So do not use soft water. And now the next thing to remember is to water thoroughly. You don't want to just water the top. Okay, if you just water the top, the roots down below are probably going to be getting drier and drier and drier. And so you'll get the moisture up here. You won't get the deeper roots that you need for a good plant survival there. So water thoroughly. In other words, I always have a double tray system under my plants. I've got the tray of the pot, and hopefully you can see this in the little picture. I've got the tray of the pot itself, and then I have another tray that I put underneath that. And that's so that I can water through, and I don't have to worry about the water from the plant leaking out of the pot and getting my furniture destroyed. I love my wife, and I want to keep my wife. So I don't want to have the water running out of the pot of the plant and then onto the furniture. So I have another tray to catch that. Well, that serves two purposes. Again, that kind of serves as a pebble tray for a little bit higher humidity, but it also allows me to water that through. If you don't water that through, the salts of your fertilizers will build up in that soil, creating kind of a drought situation. And so if you can keep that water, you don't want to flow through a whole bunch of it. You don't want to flush all the fertilizer out, but you want to water that through so that you're getting the flow all the way through the soil. And then it does a lot better that way.
Ron, we had a question about your peace lily. Okay. Somebody asked, is it the salt that burns the leaves?
It is on that one. Now, there may be other conditions that do that, but over-fertilizing can kind of cause the same kind of problem because fertilizers are a salt. Underwatering can kind of cause the same kind of problem. It's actually a drought response is what it is, because the salts are building up in the soil and they're holding onto the water tighter than the plant can pull it away. So yeah, it's the salt in the water softener, in the soft water, that's causing the problem. Long answer to a short question, yeah. Okay, now drainage. I want to talk about drainage. Drainage is very, very important. You want to have that drain out, again, so that fertilizer so you don't get the salts built up in the soil, because that can happen quite quickly. Now, if you've got a salty water, like softened water, you're not really solving the problem that way. Let's do our poll. I did want to ask that question about pots here. What is the best type of pot? One that is attractive and fits the theme of the room. Clay pots, plastic pots, ceramic pots, any pot that is the right size and has drainage holes. Sure that, yeah, the drainage. I don't care. I don't like the clay pots myself. They suck water out and they dry out a lot faster, personally. Or ceramic pot. Now, the ceramic pots are fine. They're sealed, but the clay pots, those terracotta type pots, they suck the moisture out. Plastic pots I actually kind of like because they don't have that issue. But one of the things, whatever it is, all this other stuff is fine, but this is the main point. Make sure that they have the drainage and it's the right size for the plant. And so you may need to pop things up a little bit. Anyway, all right, fertilizing. Plants produce their own food, so we don't feed plants. We provide them fertilizer, and then they produce their own food. That's what photosynthesis is. Their food is the carbohydrates that they produce. So we don't feed plants. I'm not going to feed you. You can feed your fish and all that kind of stuff, but you don't feed your plants. They're producing their own food. And it changes with the season. So during the winter, typically you want to reduce your fertilizing. During the summer, you want to increase the fertilizer a little bit. Now, how you do it, it's kind of up to you. I like to get the water-soluble fertilizer, put it in with my water, and fertilize them that way. You can get those plant stakes if you want to, that stick into the soil. That one works okay too. It just kind of creates a concentrated fertilizer spot that the roots go over and kind of pick that up. That works fine. They have the Osmocote type fertilizer they put into the potting mix, and eventually that will kind of break down and get used up, and so you'll need to replace it. But You want to change that though with the season as the plant's growing more or growing less. And so typically wintertime you fertilize a lot less. And different plants have different requirements, and there are different forms of fertilizer. And I talked about that. Remember that fertilizers are salts, and so if you over fertilize, you're going to create a salty condition in the soil there that the roots again the plant can't pull the moisture away from that. That's why if you spill nitrogen fertilizer on a patch of your lawn, a big amount of it, the lawn will die, because you've sucked all the moisture, that's salt, and it's sucking all the moisture away from the plants. And that's why the plant actually dies, because of the salts in the soil. All right, this is probably where there's poll number 8, or I did 8, so this is poll number 9. All right, okay, poll number 9. This is the last one. All right, true or false? It is okay to use an attractive pot without holes in the bottom, as long as you put large rocks or pottery shards in the bottom to provide drainage. So it's actually false on here. The rocks and the shards do not actually increase the drainage, and they can create a kind of a puddle under there. What happens is water will go down until it hits a texture exchange, and then it kind of sits there and it builds up until the gravity kind of forces it down. And so you don't really get good drainage that way. And then it can kind of fill in the bottom and then start wicking back up. Case in point, we've got a plant, the Queen's Tears plant that, again, it was one of my wife's grandparents had. And it's got a beautiful Christmas blossom. It blooms in the Christmas time, around Christmas time as well. And it's in a pot. It's in a pot that drains, but then it's in a bigger pot underneath to kind of, so it doesn't destroy but it's hard to see because this thing it's a bromeliad, and so it's got these big long strands of grassy kind of really rough kind of grassy kind of leaves, and so you can't see how wet it is in there. I was going to put it here, but I pulled it, man, it was feeling pretty heavy, and so I took it into the bathtub, and that pot had a bunch of water, because every time we water the other plants, let's water that one too, we water the other plants, let's water that one too, and so I had a lot of water in there. It's basically the same kind of concept. I couldn't see how much water it had already, and so it was getting too much water. So the same kind of a thing with the shards and the rocks in the bottom of the pot. You can't see how much water it's getting. It's better, you have the drainage holes instead of those shards or rocks.
Ron, somebody asked, are they needed in a pot with holes?
No, absolutely not. You don't. Some people will put that to make it a shallower root system kind of a thing, and I'm not sure why they're doing that. Maybe they just don't want to put as much, the potting soil is too expensive or something. No, don't. Just put the soil in there down to the hole. The same kind of a thing. The water will kind of fill in there until it gets to that point where the gravity will pull that through the hole, but then it's draining right out, and you've got that water through there and it's draining out. It's not collecting in the bottom of the pot. So I don't even put those in the pots that have the holes. Don't put the shards or anything like that. Doesn't serve any purpose. Okay, that's where the number 8 was supposed to be. Okay, so containers, shape, your clay pots, your plastic pots, the ceramic pots, those are all fine. No big deal there, okay? Just make sure that you have drainage. All right, now repotting. Sometimes your plants, like, for example, my Christmas cactus is getting actually quite large, and every few years we'll take a branch off that and actually just start a new plant with it. So it's the same plant, or it gets really big and doing really well. Either that, or when we moved up to Moscow, or our son tipped it off the plant shelf and broke off half of it. That works too, but sometimes it gets to where it's just got a lot of stress on it, so you can just start over. But it's the same plant, and you can repot it. But if you're going to do some repotting, you want to check the root ball. So basically, with repotting, you're going to put the plant in a larger container. And so it's been growing in this container for a long time, and you got those roots are bound right around the plant, and you've got this root ball. And so the plant, when you put it into a new pot and just put the soil around it, those roots are continuing to grow where they are, kind of eventually they kind of crawl out into it. But that's you need to kind of rejuvenate those roots and rejuvenate the plant itself. So you check that root ball, and if it's root bound, then you need to cut off those roots on the outside. Cut those off. Take a knife and cut off the outside edge. Shave that off and put that into the new pot. Now you've taken off a lot of the roots, and so you may have to prune the top out a little bit too to keep them in balance. But you're going to have stress on when you replant anyway. But rejuvenate that. You may want to be refreshing the soil. Get a whole new plant, new pot of soil, and so you can take those root balls and wash them out and wash out all that soil out of the plant, and then repot it into new soil, and that works just fine too. If you need to, trim the roots. Again, house plants, because they're in pots, we're not as worried about as if we're planting plants outdoors, but you want to trim those roots if they're root bound so that they will expand out into the new pot if you're doing sizing up on a pot. And then prune to balance. So if you've shaved off the roots, you want to prune back on the top so that we maintain that balance. Give it some time to recover. Typically, you'll want to put that in a shadier spot for a little while, for a few days, probably no more than a week, and then gradually move it back towards its normal spot. But with the first time when you first get it transplanted, move it to a shadier location for a few days. Okay, training and shaping. Things that we can do in plants, if it's getting a little bit lopsided to one side or the other, you can pinch them back. You can train plants to trellis. Now, I can't remember if I'm going to go into this or not, but I've got some plants here I want to talk about here in just a few minutes. So you can do disc budding. So like if you have, you brought some chrysanthemums into the house, you got some chrysanthemums from the store or whatever, and you want to keep them bushy, well, that can get kind of leggy. And so you can pinch those back to a bud or to a leaf so that they'll branch out and fill in a little bit better. You can just pinch off the bud. Trellising a viney type plant, you can trellis those if you want to inside the house, but you probably want to make it in a place that you're not going to have to be moving that trellis around very much because it's pretty messy that way. Now the soil, typically what we're using in houseplants is soilless medium. In other words, it's not mineralized, doesn't have any mineral in it. It's got a lot of compost, organic matter kinds of things. Now it will, a lot of times you'll have perlite in there or vermiculite, and that's a mineral. And so it's not entirely true. Sometimes they'll have sand in there. I know the potting soil mix that we used up at Rick's College, we had sand and we had peat moss and we had perlite. And sometimes add a vermiculite into that mix, so it's not always soilless medium, but a lot of the potting soil that we get at the store is soilless medium. It's not really soil, it's organic matter. The things that the soil provides are nutrients. The water holds the water for a period of time, so the plant can have water and oxygen. It provides oxygen as well. The roots have to have oxygen, and so you want to make sure that's again why you want that drainage so that we can drain that water out and we got oxygen around the roots as well as the moisture because it's got to have both of those. And then it also provides support. It keeps it stable. If you get a plant that's too heavy, I've got a jade plant in my office and it was looking beautiful. Jade plant's roots are really quite shallow, but anyway, I had it good, stable, and it tipped off my desk one day. So it broke off of some big branches. So I had to prune it back into a shape. And I'm not sure why it tipped off. I never did quite figure out. Didn't see the mouse that pushed it over, I guess. Different soils, different plants require different soils. So your cacti prefer a sandier, lighter, sandier kind of a soil. And your orchids grow on bark. But the main thing, again, always you want good drainage and the water holding capacity that's necessary for those plants. No rocks, okay? No garden soil. Problem with garden soil is that you're pulling in all the weeds and all that kind of stuff from the garden soil as well. I should have brought that plant in. I've got a Dracaena over in the living room that's got a butternut squash growing in it. I'm not sure. I think probably because I was using some potting soil from when I was planting my vegetables. Anyway, it's been growing in there since last fall. Haven't got any fruit off it yet, but anyway. So don't use garden soil. Different special soils, again, your African violets, as gloxinias, begonias, calla lilies, and other tropical plants, they like that well-drained, high in humus type plant. They're not looking for the sandy soil. By the same token, the sandy soil, the succulents, they're looking more for drainage and less organic. They want mostly minerals as opposed to the high organic kind of soils. And so there's a little bit of difference, a requirement there. Orchids grow on bark. And I don't grow orchids. My sister-in-law does. She does beautiful plants and everything. But okay, pests. Typically, we don't get a lot of pests in the house, but probably the one thing you want to do is to, when you get a new plant, don't just take it in and set it with all your other plants. Quarantine it for a few days. When we were first married, my wife and I, we went down to Utah to visit some family and stopped off at that nursery that used to be at the point of the mountain, which isn't the point anymore. Down by Thanksgiving Point, there was a nursery down there, and so we bought a Queen's Palm, brought it home, and had it with our other plants, and found out that thing was lousy with spider mites. I didn't know nothing about it at the time. And so it lousy with spider mites. We got the spider mites taken care of on all the other plants. We never could quite get that Queen's Palm to recover from the spider mites. So we ended up eventually throwing it out, but quarantine your plants for a little while. So your common houseplant pests, sometimes spider mites can be a problem. Whiteflies can be a problem because whiteflies survive very well in greenhouses, and that's typically where our houseplants come from. And so whiteflies can be an issue. They don't survive our winters here, but then our houseplants don't survive the winters here either, typically. Fungus gnats are probably the biggest one that we have here. And the best way to handle fungus gnats, the best way is to not keep your soil too wet. They like to get in that wet soil and survive, and they'll breed, and the maggots are down in the soil eating on the roots, and the gnats are up flying around being kind of a pain. Typically, I have never really had many problems with the aphids, the scales, or mealybugs, but they're always a potential, especially if you're bringing house in. You take your house plants out and put them on the patio or the deck or whatever during the summertime and bring them back into the house, then they're more likely to get some of those outside type pests into your house plants. So kind of be aware of those issues as well that might cause problems. So you want to check regularly. And cleanliness is really important. Don't leave big piles of leaves on top of the soil. That's a good place for the bugs, the pests to kind of harbor. Drainage, again, is really important there. So different ways you can handle this with, you've got pests or diseases in your plants. Options, you wash the foliage on a regular basis, and that'll take off a lot of those pests. Insecticidal soaps work really quite well. They're just a suffocation kind of a tool. You can hand pick them off if you don't have them too heavily infested. Alcohol on a cotton swab, those kinds of things. Insecticide or miticide. I don't say don't use them, but that's always the last tool I pull out of my toolbox. And so if all these other things don't work, then I might pull out a miticide or an insecticide, depending on what I'm dealing with there. So if you have the pest diseases, it's more of a cultural kind of thing, typically for most of your diseases. And then the pests, again, if you can just keep a way of keeping them down, quarantine them, and check to make sure you've got those.
Ron, we have a question.
Okay.
My succulents get scale through the winter. I use half-strength alcohol, but it reappears. Is that typical?
So do you know what kind of scale they are?
I'm waiting to see if they respond.
Well, yeah. What's the type of plant is it, and what kind of scale are they? It's not. Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, in the meantime, we'll give them a minute to answer that. Somebody else asked, what should go in potting soil if creating your own?
A good potting soil mix, if you're doing your own, is you want to get clean sand. You don't want to pull something from the sand dunes or something. You'll be pulling in seeds and weeds and all that kind of stuff. But get clean sand, about 50%, and about or maybe about 30% of the sand, or I'll make it a fairly heavy soil, and so it'll hold your plots back. And then about a 30% of the compost, 30 to 40% of compost, and then about a 20 to 30% of perlite, which is that kind of expanded white rock kind of a thing. That's a good water holding capacity. So it'll help increase your water holding capacity, but it also helps with the aeration. The compost can get kind of compacted, and so you don't get good oxygen in there. So that perlite will help that, and the sand will also help that. But you get that good mix that up. Now at Rick's College, they still have the same wagon they had when I was at school there at BYU, Idaho. It's a big wagon that they run a steamer through, and they steam it after they mix it up. And so if you're mixing your own, you got to be careful. You'd be pulling in seeds or diseases, and so you want to be careful with your source of those components.
Okay, so we have some more information.
Okay.
Just white scale on many different types of succulents. They are in my greenhouse all winter. Then I put them out on the south side of my patio.
You have to send me a picture, because I'm not quite picturing that. So if you want to continue the discussion, I'm not sure. Typically what insecticidal soap, but with scale, the problem with scale is if it's true scale, the female will kind of set up camp, and she'll attach to the branch and form this scale over the top of her, and you cannot get through that with most of your pest control options. So they're most susceptible after that female lays her eggs and they're crawling out. Well, outside, that typically is in the springtime. Where it's in the greenhouse, it's a little bit harder to tell when the crawlers are out. And so it's hard to answer the question, because you've got a controlled environment and you can't time it by the season nearly as well. Typically, your insecticidal soaps will work quite well on the crawlers, but they don't do very good on the scales. And so if you're cleaning those off and you're getting them cleaned off, the plants, with whether it's mechanical or insecticidal soap or whatever inside the greenhouse, there's got to be some reinfestation source that's going on to them. So I'm not sure. So the short answer to the question is I'm not quite sure. I need a little bit more information. So anyway, if you're interested, go ahead and send me some pictures to my email address. We can take a look at it and discuss it a little bit further. But okay, in offices, the problem with plants in the offices is who's going to take care of them when you go on vacation, or the COVID-19 situation. So yeah, they don't necessarily, they may not be taking care of them the way I want to, and so I go into my office once in a while. Just don't tell the university I do that. No, that's all right. I just go in to do that. I don't work there. Okay. Now, propagation. This is one of the fun things that I like to do. And so we can, what is it? All right. So propagation, when this particular plant right here, I'm gonna stop sharing again so I can talk about this. You can see the bigger screen. Okay, this plant it's a Dracaena, and last year I produced a video on how to air layer a Dracaena. Okay, and so this was the plant. This was the top I cut and started last year. So that was last April or so. This is the plant I took it off of. Okay. At the time, this plant had, you see these two stems right here? All it had was these two stems right there. That's what it had, these two spindly stems. And I did my air layer up here, and it was really tall and kind of lanky. And these kind of can get that way. But I did my air layer up there and then cut it off. And after I did that, I repotted this plant as well. I don't know if you can see, but right about here, about 3.5 inches above the soil line, that's where the soil level was. It was potted too deeply. I don't know if you can see that very well. Yeah, get a little closer to the camera, maybe. There we go. So it was potted to this depth right here. And so I took that out and I repotted it, and I washed it down to where we're getting this this root flare where it kind of flares out to the roots. And so I exposed that, and then this bud right here came up at that time. And this bud right here also came up. So I've got a very nice looking Dracaena, very full looking Dracaena from doing that air layering. And I've got a very nice, good sized plant. It would take more than a year to get a plant that's this big, a Dracaena, to grow that size. And so propagation is really kind of fun. Air layering is a very common way to do it. Things like the Christmas cactus, they're very easy. You've got all these aerial roots. You could take a cutting like that and they'll root very easily. So that's kind of a fun thing to do, is to get new plants, propagate them that way with houseplants. So you can do air layering. You can do just cuttings like with the Christmas cactus. You can do tip layering. There are lots of different ways that you can propagate houseplants. So it's kind of fun to explore that as well. Okay, now I've got an intermission on here. So let's take a 7-minute break at 7:20. Then we'll resume our discussion. So a little bit of relief time here. Get up and walk around, stretch your legs so you don't get too tired. And I'll resume here in just a few minutes. Dina did send me a message that there seems to be a fair amount of conversation going on about growing cacti in a house. The cacti have cacti and most of your succulents are this same way. They are plants that will really die from too much love. They're better off being neglected. And I think that's why cacti have thorns. So you don't love them too much. So you want to have a well-drained soil. And when I talked about that 1/2 inch, you want to go deeper with these. Matter of fact, my jade plant, it's actually at the office, and so it doesn't get watered very often anyway, but it doesn't want very much water at all. And when I do water it, I water it well, and then I let it go, and I let it go, and I let it go. And I don't water that thing probably more than once a month, or maybe even 6 weeks, depending on the season. Now, during the summer, I probably need to water a little bit more often. Now, the cacti, the needles are actually, the thorns, the spines are actually the leaves of the plant, and the water storage and the energy storage and everything is actually in the stem or the barrel of the cactus. And so you can move them outdoors and indoors. But main thing, if you're going to try to get some of these cacti to bloom, is you probably want to get them a little bit cooler nights, because in the desert environment they're in, it gets quite cold at night, hot during the day. And so a window, close to a window that gets a fair amount of sunlight will help to provide that cooler environment that's right close to the window, and then hotter during the day. So don't water them very often. Now, if you're going to move them outdoors during the summer, you move them to a less sunny spot to begin with, and gradually move them into the sunnier location, and then bring them back into the house if you want to. But if you're going to do that, make sure that you watch the water, because that can become, they can get too dry. Usually it's not that big of an issue with the cacti, but that kind of a thing. So hopefully that answers that particular issue on the cactus. Don't want to fertilize them very much. You don't want to water them very often. Again, if you water them completely, and then let it go for a long time. And sandier soils are better. Okay. All right, aloe vera. There we go. Now, hopefully you can all see the pictures now. Sorry about that. Technology, don't you gotta love it. Okay, this is the Joseph's coat or calico plant. Tricolored yellow-green and kind of an orangish red. And that's probably actually the bracts, not the flowers, that are giving you that color, but it might be the flower. Norfolk Island pine. They're kind of a fun plant, but they get quite large, and so they do well in commercial buildings. Probably not as good. I've seen them in homes, but they get pretty big eventually. It's yeah. Anyway, this is the queen palm. This is the one that I brought home from the nursery. It's not the plant, but this is the type of plant that I brought home from the nursery, and ended up with spider mites infesting my situation. So the aloe vera, less water, the Norfolk Island pine and the Queen's palm, a little bit more water for these. I love this particular plant. This ponytail palm was one of the first plants I gave my wife. It's got that little bulb there at the bottom of the plant. That's a water holding structure. And so it will tolerate droughty conditions really quite well. The leaves are a pretty stiff grass-like type leaf, and it can get quite large. Mine was getting quite large before I gave it to somebody. We gave it to somebody when we were moving around one of our moves, and I don't know how they did it, but they ended up killing it. It's a hard one to kill. It's a really nice, tough plant. I really like that one. And I've seen really big ponytail palms, greenhouse. I can't remember if that was in South Carolina or anyway. My wife and I went to a greenhouse, one of our conference, and there they had this massive ponytail palm, 25 to 30 feet tall kind of thing. It was really cool. Anyway, that's a nice one there. This was the croton. It's got, again, a tricolor kind of a thing. They like highlight situations, and they tolerate, you see these, when they get these kind of waxy leaves like that, a lot of times that's a pretty good indicator that they'll tolerate the drought quite well too. So you don't have to water this one as often. It's not quite as sensitive to too much water as the aloe vera and the cacti are, but you can overwater it, so you have to be kind of careful with that one. Jade plant, I love the jade plant and the shade of the texture of its branches and the shape and things like that. It likes the highlight situation, and again, you can really let this one go dry, quite dry. But then keep in mind, I think part of what happened was my pot, because I let it go so dry, my pot was really quite light as opposed to how heavy the top of the plant was, and that's probably why it tipped over. So you have to make sure you've got it in a little bit heavier pot or a little bit bigger. They don't require a very deep root, but they do. I got mine so dry sometimes it was actually sending aerial roots out of the branches, trying to pull moisture out of the air. So when it starts doing that, yeah, I probably need to water just a little bit more, but it still tolerated it just fine and did quite well in that kind of a situation. All right.
Ron, we have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
That picture reminded me of I had an amaryllis that had a baby bulb. I had no idea how to nurture it. It lived for a long time, but it didn't change in size. So what do you do if there's a baby amaryllis?
Did you separate it? You separate them out and then let them grow. So the amaryllis, the best thing to do for those is to get them separate into their own pot, get them into good full sun during the summer to get some size on the bulb. Otherwise, they have a hard time getting the flower to form on those. Yeah, that's just a way of they propagate, and so you can separate. Don't try to grow the bulb on the old one. Just separate, so you got two separate bulbs, and then just try to grow it out through a good lot of light, summertime kind of a thing. Get some good size on it.
And then earlier, somebody also mentioned allium. I've never heard of allium grown indoors, and I wondered if maybe they meant amaryllis.
Perhaps allium is the onion family.
Yeah, well, there's the globe allium and the gladiator that have those huge purple globe flowers on them.
Uh-huh. And those are typically outdoor plants. I've never seen them indoors either, but.
Right, I haven't either. Okay, so a little bit more on the amaryllis. She said the bulb itself in direct light or in partial soil.
Well, you want to bury those down about an inch to two, about an inch deep on the soil, so that you got the bottom of the bulb in the soil, and then let the leaves grow. Because those bulbs are pretty much, I mean, they don't go very deep in the soil. Usually they're sitting right on top of the soil. So don't bury them deep. But when you get them growing, you want the leaves to be in full sunlight. All right. Now this one is an interesting plant. This is the Hoya or wax plant. That's what this one is right here. This is one. My wife was born in a maternity home here in Rigby, Idaho, and there in the room, the delivery room, there was this Hoya, and it's kind of a tricolored. It's kind of hard to see right now, but it's got the pink leaves, and it'll have totally white leaves on it. And they usually fall off because they're not doing any photosynthesis. The plant just kind of sheds those, but it's kind of interesting.
Your photos are all scrolling through like crazy.
That was my finger. Sorry about that. I was turned around. Boy, it really did go like crazy.
Yeah.
Man.
Sorry, keep telling us about your wife.
So anyway, her mother, get back to the Hoya here. Her mother took a cutting off that. So this is a plant that is my wife's birth plant, and it struggles a little bit. The tricolored Hoya. Do I need to switch this back again? Swap. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So anyway, it's got this really cool flower, cluster of flowers, and it's quite fragrant. This one has only flowered for us once in the whole time, and my wife's, of course, she's only 21, so it hasn't been that long. But anyway, some people get those to flower every year, and I'm not sure why ours struggles quite so badly. So that's the Hoya. Peperomia. This one's a fun plant. Again, it sends up a flower, and the flower on this one looks a lot like the flower on a plantain, a broadleaf plantain. Kind of ugly, but anyway, it's very drought tolerant. It's got the thick, succulent, waxy leaves, and so it does quite well. We've got some that are in the office that I encourage people to stop neglecting the plants quite so much, and so they've got some of these, and there's actually a lot more white on the leaves that we've got in the office here in Idaho Falls. So anyway, it's a fun plant, does well. Again, highlight situations. This one, burro's tail, is again another succulent. It's a drooping succulent, so a hanging basket kind of a plant. Again, you don't want to water them too much. Most of these succulents, just don't water them, overwater them. Highlight situations. Adonidia palm, another highlight plant. The amaryllis, I love the plant. It's they're very photogenic. these pictures I've taken here, you've got these large, beautiful blossoms coming out, and you've got even the stamens, your anthers, and the petioles. I mean, just a beautiful flower, and fun to take pictures of that one. Even your geraniums can do well, but they like a higher light in a house, especially. They do better if you've got them in a highlight situation. But I've had my geraniums bloom inside the house and do very nicely there in that kind of a situation. So those are your more common highlight plants that require a little bit higher light. Now, medium light, these are the ones, they might take a little bit of direct sunlight, but not a whole lot. And so you want to keep them in mostly shady but fairly bright light. This springieri asparagus. Asparagus fern is a lot of times what we call that one. The fishtail palm. Spider plant. Now the spider plant is kind of fun. Of course, you can propagate those. It sends off these, like a strawberry plant. It's got the runners, the stolons, the stems that kind of come over, and then they sit on the ground and they start a new plant. So that's one way you can propagate new plants, and these are quite easy. The interesting thing about the spider plant is it's got a very it stores a lot of moisture in its roots, and so it can tolerate drought conditions. It'll tell you when it's dry, but it can tolerate pretty droughty conditions without dying. But it starts to look a pale green when it starts getting a little bit too dry. So, I got to water my spider plant. So this is a spider plant, is one of those that if you have a tendency to be a little bit more neglectful than is good for the plants, it'll actually survive fairly well and recover from that kind of a situation. Now the Dieffenbachia or dumb cane, again, keep in mind that this one is, the reason you call it dumb cane is because it can paralyze the tongue, so you don't want the kids to chew on this one. But it does quite well, and it's actually a fairly popular houseplant. If you got grandkids, I wouldn't worry doing about too much. All right, this is I have quite a few of these just because they're so fun to propagate, but the dracaenas, there's several different types of dracaenas. There's the The Dracaena marginata is this one over here on the left. That's the one that I've got did the air layering video on. And then these are some wider leaved, and there are a lot of different Dracaena cultivars. So they are actually a monocot, a grass related closer to the grasses than they are to the dicots or broadleaf plants. Some of your figs, your fiddle leaf fig over here on the left, kind of cool. The leaf is actually shaped kind of like a fiddle body, a violin body, and then the Benjamin fig. They both do really, really well indoors. The Ben fig is interesting. When you move and you take the Ben fig with you, Benjamin fig, it will lose almost all its leaves and then leaf back out again when you put it in a new location. It's kind of frustrating at times, but you think, oh, dang, my plant's died, and then it comes back out with new leaves. So a lot of times moving that, and it's kind of throws you for a loop there. Prayer plant or Maranta. At nighttime, the leaves close up, and that's why they call it a prayer plant. So they'll fold together, and then during the daytime, to catch the sunlight, they open up like that. So, medium light plants, some of your begonias. Begonias are an understory flower, so you can do the angel wing begonias or the fibrous begonias, even the tuberous begonias can do quite well in a house situation. And they've got beautiful flowers, so you can get those to flower indoors if you wanted to. This is the Christmas cactus. Again, this is the one that I've got here behind me that's finally, it started blooming just before Christmas, and it's still blooming. It's about done, so that's pretty good long blooming season for a Christmas cactus. These are bromeliads here, and this one on the right, this is the one that I was talking about that had the water in the bottom of the pot and everything. It blooms at Christmas time with the Christmas cactus. It's got this really pretty kind of a pale green flower, these corolla and the blue stripes on the outside of it, and then it's got your stigma with your anther filaments coming out here. It's really quite pretty flower, and then here's your pistil is clear out on this way, or the female part of the flower. So, but that's a fun one to grow. It's kind of got ugly leaves, and it's that pretty ugly during most of the year, but I like the flower at Christmas time, so I keep it around.
Ron?
Yeah.
I have a question about the bromeliad, and then somebody else asked a question about figs. So I've grown a couple different bromeliads, and I can never get them to flower more than once. Why is that?
They're kind of like raspberries. They're a biennial or a perennial root with a biennial top, and so once the flower dies, that top needs to die down and be replaced by another top, and so they may require a little bit more light than we're giving them in the house. This one that I have, this Queen's Tears, it's Bilbergia nutans is the scientific name for it. It does quite well in the medium light situations, but some of these bromeliads require maybe a little bit more light. But usually that's you've got to let that one the one that flowered has got to die, and another one's got to come and take its place.
Okay, so then somebody asked about figs. Can they fruit inside here?
If they get enough light, they can. Yeah, I've seen them do it. Actually, the most common when I've seen them do it has been in a greenhouse situation rather than in the house itself. But they can, not very often. But these are not edible figs. I don't think they're not very edible. They're not like the fig trees that we have outside, which we can't grow here, of course. So, if you have a atrium type of a room, you could probably get figs to do quite well here. Again, you're modifying the environment. Okay, so then we have this Chinese fan palm. These take up a lot of space, so you don't want one of these unless you've got a lot of room for it. Big rooms. I don't have any big rooms in my house, so it's not one that I would want. And the aluminum plant, kind of an interesting, they'll tolerate even a little bit lower lights, but they'll get kind of leggy if you get them in too low of a light. So that's a pretty good indicator that this is one of those that, all right, I need to move it a little bit closer because it's getting longer stems and kind of stringy looking. The umbrella tree or the Scheffleras are pretty fun plant, and these can be propagated. Well, most all these can be propagated with air layering or cuttings. This is the wandering Jew and the Tradescantia or inch plant. A really nice hanging plant. The problem with these, both of them, especially the wandering Jew, is that the old leaves will fall off and they'll get really quite stringy looking, and so you kind of have to keep them pinched back or just repropagate them into another pot kind of a thing, or they'll get stringy and kind of ugly looking. The Tradescantia is not quite so bad, or the inch plant's not quite so bad that way, but they can get, yeah, kind of stringy looking. So low light plants, these are plants that will do well in a good north window or away from the window, south or west windows a fair ways, and still do pretty good. And so we have these Chinese evergreen, this very common old style plant that they've had around for a long time. And the main reason is because it's a good hardy plant. As long as you keep it watered and you give it some light, it does quite well. The ferns, they like to have low light. They don't like so much direct light. And so if you can keep them away from direct light, put them in a corner or away from the window kind of a thing, they do quite well. But they require more moisture. You don't want these to dry out. Ferns don't like it dry at all. So this is one of those where a ½ inch is probably just bordering about almost too dry when you're doing your finger method. But again, you don't want to water them so much that they're sitting in a puddle all the time either. So your Boston fern, and then this maidenhair fern is really kind of cool. It's got this almost like a ginkgo leaf on there, the ginkgo biloba tree, kind of a fan-shaped leaf. It's pretty cool. Okay, the cast iron plant is another one. It kind of fits along with that Chinese, I can't remember it. The Chinese evergreen, the cast iron plant. The cast iron plant, kind of along that, it's got those speckled plant, leaves on there, but it does quite well in those low environments. An old style, probably they call it cast iron plant because it's kind of hard to kill it even indoors. The African violet is an interesting, it prefers fairly moist, even soils, but you don't want to get the moisture on the leaves. It doesn't, you'll start getting disease form on the leaves or spots on the leaves where you have the water sitting. And so when you water that, make sure you water the soil and not the leaf. Now this is interesting. This is pothos or devil's ivy. Down in Ephraim, Utah, there's a restaurant. I think it's called the Snow Dragon or something like that. It's a Chinese restaurant, and they have this pothos that's growing all around the ceiling, up in between, and all over the place. It's actually kind of interesting. You see that plant. I mean, I don't know why they do it, but well, other than it's there. But anyway, it can get long and does really quite well. Pretty tough. You need to make sure you don't need to water it a lot, but don't let it get too dry. The philodendrons are quite fun to grow. This one here, this heartleaf philodendron on the left, Wayne Jones, who was here before he retired, and he had a heartleaf philodendron in his office. He left in May. He retired in May, and I got hired in November. And when I got there was still green on the plant, but it was on its very last leg. It was sucking the leaf out of the moisture out of the stems. The stems had basically died. I couldn't revive it, but they've got some really cool variegated cultivars of this. Maybe they're even varieties, but of this heartleaf philodendron is really quite attractive little plant, and it does well in the low light situations. Most of these, the split leaf philodendron and these others they just do really well. But they can get quite big. The heartleaf philodendron is a fairly small one. This here, the split leaf, and these others, they've got these large leaves, and so again, it's one of those where you want to make sure that you've got them in a big room, or they can just kind of dwarf your situation. This snake plant is actually it grows outside down in Austin, Texas. This is a landscape plant, and so it'll tolerate a little bit of frost once in a while, but not very much. but it'll tolerate the growing conditions down in Austin, Texas, and do quite well there. It's got the very sharp point, tall, lanky, and they can fill in quite well. Does well again in your lower light situations. Stick it out in a corner. Your arrowhead plant again is another one. This one you don't want to let it get too dry. If you get it too dry, it's got the thinner leaf and doesn't have that waxy cover on them like a lot of your succulents and things like that do. So anyway, so that's just some examples of house plants. If you can grow it outside, you can probably grow it inside, but it may not be quite enough light for some of those plants. So try it out and see. But that's what I had there. So again, house plants. If you don't have a green thumb, it's just because you're not providing the right environment. And it's just a matter of paying attention to the plant. Don't love it to death and don't totally neglect it. And so any questions at this point?
I'll ask a question while we wait to see if there's any others.
Okay.
So my neighbor called me about 2 months ago and asked me to come look at some plants. And she had 4 different asparagus ferns that she had in different lighting situations and watered them differently in her house. And she's quite a successful farmer outside, but she killed all of them and I couldn't help her save them. They were too far gone. So are they hard to keep alive or?
They're a bit more of a challenge. They require more moisture. And so letting them get too dry can really set them off. You'll lose a lot of leaves on them and things like that. So they don't, I don't know if it was too much light or I don't know without seeing the conditions. So they can be a challenge, but I've seen some places, some of these houses that have a split entry house that goes up and down from the door, and they have a balcony kind of a thing up there, and they'll have those asparagus ferns sitting there and seem to be doing really quite well. But again, moisture is really important on that one.
Okay. They aren't something I've ever grown before, so I didn't know.
Yeah. Well, they kind of shed leaves, and so I don't particularly like them that much either. But
okay, so somebody asked if you have a resource for us to find out what the range is for highlight, medium light, and low light.
Probably the best. I don't have one that I've put together other than what I've got right here. But what the best reliable sources I usually find is when I do a search, I'll search for houseplants, and then I always include site:/edu, site:/edu, and that way you're going to get sites that end with edu. They're university that have been doing research and put together fact sheets, and so that's usually where I go when I search for information for something I don't know about. That way I'm pretty confident that it's been based on research and not on somebody trying to sell me something or something like that, or some fly-by-night person that whatever. Anyway, so that's the way I would search for it if I wanted to find out specific, but I don't have a list of how.
We lost Ron. So sometimes he does cut out. I'll see if I can get him back really quick so we can answer this question about African violets. I do know. Oh, there you are.
What, did I disappear?
Yes, you did.
Oh, that's my unstable internet connection. Yeah, I just barely got the text. We lost you. At what point did I stop talking?
I think we got most of the idea of what you were saying. It was just that you're talking about searching for things.
Oh, yeah.
I think, am I remembering right? I think the University of Idaho does have a small publication on houseplants as well.
I don't know. I haven't found. Sometimes it's hard to find their publications. I knew that we got that chapter in the Master Gardener book, but it's kind of simple.
Okay, so we do have one question about African violets. Somebody asked, how do you get African violets to flower? Do they need to be pot bound?
No, nothing really. A lot of times the flowering is based on, well, of course, the environmental conditions, and I'm not sure if African violets are photoperiodism situation or not. I don't think they are. But let's see, I had a thought there and it just kind of escaped me. The even moisture and things like that, the enough light, they don't like direct sunlight. As a matter of fact, they do really quite well in a north window kind of a thing. I have never personally, my mother-in-law's had African violets. My one of the secretaries there in the office has an African violet, and she's got it in a north window, and it's doing really quite well. It's just a matter of, a lot of times it's a physiological size. They need to get to a certain size before they'll start blooming. Same kind of a thing with onions and things like that too. So I would have to do a little more research on how you can force African violets to bloom. I'm not as familiar with those as some other people are.
Okay. And then somebody asked if you have suggestions for growing herbs inside.
Yeah, I see that, Lisa. So the main thing, most of your herbs prefer a little bit more light, and so otherwise you get kind of pretty leggy, and so you need to have them in a fairly high light situation, most of them. Now there are a few that will do well in an understory kind of a situation, but that's usually the biggest problem is they come in, they get kind of leggy and stretchy because they're just not getting enough light.
I can tell you the one time I had really good success growing herbs inside. I had the corner of a room where there was a window right here that faced south, and then a wall right here, and I hung baskets all down that wall, and they were pretty happy there. But each of them, they all had sunlight most of the day. So
yeah. Well, houseplants are a lot of fun. They add a lot to the environment of our homes and our shopping malls when we get back out to them, and commercial buildings and whatnot. I think it's fun. It keeps me going during the winter time. I've got to have something growing. I get tired about the end of October. I'm tired of vegetable gardening, and so I'm ready to shut down, and I wait until about February before I start my plants for my garden again. And so during that 3 or 4 month period, I've got my house plants to kind of help me keep happy too. So
Jane mentioned that she loves Miracle Grow right after the African violet conversation, and I'm thinking she meant for those. And I do notice with some of my flowering house plants that they do tend to flower about a week after I fertilize every year.
Yeah. So that's important, and that may be part of the issue. You need to fertilize them, but make sure that the fertilizer you use for these plants that you want, and I probably should have mentioned this, the plants that you want to flower, you want to use a fertilizer that's higher in the second number than it is in the first and third number. So you got the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The phosphorus is the fertilizer that supports the blossom more than the other. The nitrogen is more for the green growth, and so if you want green growth type house plants, then that's the fertilizer you want to do. Just don't over fertilize, but use the nitrogen. So it'd be like a 10-16-10 or 10-16-5 or something like that. Something that's got more phosphorus in it than the nitrogen or potassium. And that will help with the blooming as well.